Welcome to Russian Intelligence with Kevin Riehle. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our historian and curator, Dr. Andrew Hammond, will be interviewing Kevin about his new book, Russian Intelligence, a case-based study of Russian services and missions, past and present. And Andrew and I are both going to remind you, this book is available free to download. So it's really quite an amazing opportunity. And Andrew's going to be more formally introducing Kevin in a minute. But first, we like to give you just a little taste of the subject matter as it appears in our exhibition. So I just thought I'd share a few ways that Russian intelligence pops up at the Spy Museum. Of course, there is a lot of Russian intelligence in our exhibits, but one of the first things you'll see in our Tools of the Trade gallery is, of course, the Great Seal. And that is the fabulous 1945 KGB creation that was gifted to the American ambassador in Moscow. And Harriman received it and kept it in his residential office, and it stayed in place until 1952 when they discovered, oh my goodness, it was a listening device. So very crafty. And I'm going to challenge our listeners and Kevin and Andrew. I've been trying to figure out if the original is somewhere. All the museums that I'm aware of have very well created replicas. So if anybody knows where the original thing, the Great Seal, is, I would love to know that. And then right at the end of your trip to the Spy Museum, you will see this area which focuses on the Russian 10, and those are the illegals that were rolled up in 2010. And we have all sorts of cool dead drop markers, and then those are the handcuffs that were used in the arrests of all of the Russian 10. So we have some interesting things that go way back farther, and these that are almost up to the present day. So enough from me. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, I'm really excited to speak to you again, Kevin. One of the things that I loved about your book was that on the back and the description about your biography, it says that you were a counterintelligence analyst for no less than 30 years. You got your PhD from one of the best schools for this subject in the world, King's College London. You've published in leading journals. And then the part that I really loved was, and he has been interviewed by the International Spy Museum for its podcast, Spycast. So I just want to congratulate you on today being on a Curator's Corner. You've now got the programming equivalent of a Victoria Cross and a Medal of Honor. So thanks for that shout. And just to get going, Kevin, we're going to look at who Russian intelligence is, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and so forth. But just to start off, can you tell us, do you think it's more Russian intelligence, or do you think it's just intelligence agencies that happen to be on behalf of Russia? Give us an understanding of your analysis of that, and maybe compare it to American intelligence.
There's a lot of similarities across intelligence services around the world. There's a lot of tradecraft that is tried and tested, that works, that a lot of intelligence services use. But there are some differences with Russian and some Russian idiosyncrasies that make Russian intelligence and security services probably a little different in some ways. One is their connection to their history. Russian intelligence services and security services celebrate their history and their origins probably more than most. And they do that because they can then use that history to convince the Russian population in particular that they're there for the good of the country, that they're the most patriotic, they are the strongest and the best of the best. And that historical connection gives them that information on which to build that heroic image. Another significant difference between Russian services and others is their focus on internal threats. Every security service in the world looks at internal threats, but with the Russian services, that internal threat is invariably connected to an external threat as well. What I call in the book a chekist mindset, where the two are always connected. If there isn't any manifestation of internal dissent, the first interpretation of that is that it has a foreign linkage, whether that foreign linkage exists or not. And so that is something that has existed in Russian services from the Tsarist era through the Soviet era to today. And so that internal focus is something that's very, very specific to a Russian service.
And one thing that you draw out in the book, which I find quite interesting, is that you identify a thread that goes all the way from the Ukraina under the Tsarist autocracy through the Cheka, which is there in the early days of the revolution, the NKVD in the interwar period going into the Second World War, the KGB, and then the post-Soviet services. So that's quite interesting how all of that gets enfolded into this understanding of what Russian intelligence is.
And the reason that thread is so easy to find is because the Russians themselves talk about it. They don't hide that at all. In fact, Russian services celebrate anniversaries. They in the past 5 years, a number of intelligence and security service anniversaries have occurred, and they tie back to the Soviet era. The 100th anniversary of the VCK was in 2017. The 100th anniversary of foreign intelligence and illegals and military counterintelligence and counterintelligence have all been in the last 5 years. And when they look at that, those who are celebrating that, Vladimir Putin and the directors of the services, don't make a significant break in what is happening today from what happened in the Cheka period. There are some differences that they put into that. In fact, one of the big differences is that the Cheka was its own description, the avenging sword of the revolution. Today, the concept of revolution is downplayed. So the revolutionary aspect of the early Cheka and the early OGPU and those organizations is not what is emphasized. What is emphasized is the protection of the state, the protection of the leader, the protection of the ideology, and the importance that the state security service has in preventing foreign infiltrations and invasions. That is how they see their legacy. And that goes even beyond, further back than the Cheka to the Okhrana. And even with the border guard service, in 2012, the Russian government issued a postage stamp commemorating the 500th anniversary of the border guard service, going back to the days just before Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, his father. And although there's some historical debate about really whether that is an appropriate anniversary. Part of the Federal Security Service today, the Border Guard Service, commemorated that 500th anniversary. So looking at history is very important for them because it gives them a glorified view of their own actions.
I find it quite interesting because we're not going to go too far into this, but I find it quite interesting because other countries that have seen very different ideological structures placed over society, they've went on to try to transcend or forget about some part of their past, but it doesn't matter if it's Tsarist autocracy or the Stalin era or Andropov, it's still all part of the same lineage. But just before we go on to discuss who Russian intelligence is, just you mentioned the chekist mindset there, and I believe is it the 20th of December this year? There's or the 20th of December every year is Chekist Day. So can you tell us what the chekist mindset is?
A chekist is a person who dates their origin back to the Cheka, or the Extraordinary Commission that was established, that Lenin established in 1917 in order to protect the new Bolshevik revolutionary government. A chekist today is someone who looks back at that history and connects themselves to that legacy. That chekist mindset that I mentioned in the book is one of, as I mentioned earlier, connecting internal threats to external threats. That internal threats that have always existed within the pre-revolutionary Russia, in Soviet-era Russia, and then in post-Soviet Russia, are interpreted with that through that chekist mindset as invariably having a foreign connection. That the idea of foreign agents running around in Russia and causing unrest and supporting oppositionist groups and funding or providing covert information support is a baseline expectation of someone with that chekist mindset. And that's very evident in Russian intelligence security services today, particularly the FSB, which houses the bulk of the KGB's capabilities. That as the FSB investigates somebody like Alexei Navalny, who's become quite famous over the past several years, the expectation that he has foreign information and financial support is just the baseline, and that he is in prison now to a great extent because of that.
Wow. And I think it would be good now just to discuss who they are. So what is Russian intelligence? So your book, and just to go back to Amanda's point, to me, this is a great way to do a book talk, that you can literally download the book after the program for free. That's my idea of a great book talk. So yeah, I would encourage readers to look at that. But who are Russian intelligence? So we don't have time to get into each one of them, but so in the United States, there's 18 agencies. How many are there in Russia? And tell us about some of the main ones: the SVR, the FSB, and the GRU.
There are 4 main services in Russia, 3 of which they are the heirs of the KGB. The one that isn't is the GRU, or as it's now called, the GU, the main directorate within the Russian General Staff. The R was actually dropped a few years ago officially, although everyone still calls it the GRU because the R is the word intelligence in Russian. It is the military intelligence service, and it dates its origins to the early 1920s, and actually to 1918, to the revolutionary era, and its 100th anniversary was just a few years ago. And its missions are to collect military intelligence that will support Russian military decision-making, as well as Russian strategic decision-making overall, and to conduct covert operations that support Russia's goals around the world, such as assassinations and sabotage operations. That's the primary military arm of Russia's intelligence community. The other three services all trace their origins to the KGB during the Soviet era. The biggest of those is the FSB, or the Federal Security Service, and we tend to use Russian language acronyms when we talk about Russian intelligence services. So FSB is a Russian language acronym, although in the English it is the Federal Security Service. Sometimes it's called the FSS, but not often. And it has most of the capabilities that were previously part of the KGB. That includes the internal security functions, law enforcement functions, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, economic counterintelligence, which is a separate function within the FSB and was within the Soviet security services. It also has the remnant of what was called during the Soviet era ideological counterintelligence, which essentially means protecting the regime from internal dissent. That function, which during the KGB era was called the Fifth Directorate, was abolished in 1991. But in about 1999, as Vladimir Putin was transitioning from being the FSB director himself to being the prime minister, an element called then the Department for Constitutional Security, and then the name has evolved over the past few years, has returned and looks a lot like that Fifth Directorate did during the KGB era. So that's the FSB. It has many of those KGB functions. A smaller organization is the SVR, or the Foreign Intelligence Service. It is the remnant of what during the Soviet era was called the First Chief Directorate of the KGB, and that is foreign intelligence, primarily foreign human intelligence, but also foreign computer-based and signals intelligence is connected with the SVR as well. There's also, FSB also has SIGINT, which I didn't mention, but the SIGINT is spread across multiple organizations within Russia. There's much less known about the SVR publicly because it is probably better at clandestine operations. It has a clandestine history that goes back very far, and it is very practiced in those activities. The third main heir to the KGB is something called the Federal Protective Service, or the FSO in its Russian acronym. That is presidential security and security for the whole presidential administration, not just the body of the president himself. That includes collecting intelligence around the country about the perceptions that Russians have of the president and of the president's policies, and then analyzing those to inform future presidential policies. It also then has the physical protection of about 40 or so senior leaders within the Russian government. That is a direct heir to the KGB's 9th Directorate, which was that senior leader security. There are a number of other elements within the Russian government that also have security functions and overlap to some extent with the FSB in particular. Those include things like the Federal Drug Control Service, the Investigative Committee, and the FSB's bitter rival, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, where that rivalry has been there for many decades. And part of the FSB's and KGB's history was a tug of war between whether state security was subordinate to internal affairs or not. So those are the main security organizations within Russia, FSB being by far the largest. FSB, part of the reasons why the FSB is so large is because it has the Border Control Service, or Border Guard Service, It is a very large organization of over 200,000 people, and that makes up a large portion of the FSB's manpower. So that's a brief introduction of what they look like, of who they are. Hopefully that, if you have any other questions, please.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And one thing that I find quite interesting in your book, and maybe you can help our readers understand this a little bit more, is if you were to take an average person on the street and say, okay, you've got the FSB, which does internal security, and you've got the SVR, which does foreign intelligence. The KGB goes on to become one of those two. Which one does most of its functions go to? Most people would probably say the SVR, but it's actually the FSB. But in the book, you mentioned that that's always been the purpose. It's always been about the counterintelligence state, and the foreign intelligence is to secure the regime at home, right?
That's correct. There's no easy equivalent for the FSB in any other government. If you look at the FSB, it contains functions that within the US government, if you look at it as a US equivalent, some people say, well, it's roughly equivalent to the FBI, but that is a gross underestimation. It has elements of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission. It has elements that spread across the US government, all under one organizational roof and all led by one director. So there's just no equivalent to the FSB within the US government.
Mm. And the FSB, that one's like really fascinating to me. That's the one that's most closely associated in the press with the Putin regime. That's the one that's seen as the Praetorian Guard of the Putin era. Just tell us a little bit more about that link between Putin and the FSB.
Well, the first connection between the FSB and Putin is that Putin himself was a counterintelligence officer for about 10 years, from the mid-1970s until the mid-1980s. He then moved into the foreign intelligence after that, but he was in the Second Chief Directorate, which then transitioned to the FSB when the FSB as a name was organized in 1995. So he has that connection to that function. He obviously, many of his own colleagues from his St. Petersburg, then Leningrad days in the Second Chief Directorate are now senior officers within the FSB, or have been senior officers in the FSB over the past 20 years or so. He was the director of the FSB, somewhat a surprising director in 1998 and 1999. He was surprising because everyone before him and since him who was named as a director of that state security service had reached the rank of the general officer in the KGB or subsequent organizations. The highest rank that Putin had reached was lieutenant colonel. So when he was selected as the FSB director in 1998, it was, people scratched their heads a little bit. Who is this lieutenant colonel? Where did he come from? But his connection to the FSB has been very close ever since then, as director, and then as briefly as prime minister, then since 2000 as president. And his close colleagues, there have been only two directors of the FSB since then, Nikolai Patrushev and Alexander Bortnikov, and both of those have close personal connections to Vladimir Putin and have his personal ear. So by law, by Russian law, the FSB answers directly to the president. There is no other organizational subordination between the president of the FSB and the FSB. So effectively, Putin still directs many of the FSB's efforts and the FSB is there to protect Putin, to protect his economic interests, protect his political interests, and to protect his regime around the country. So it's a mutual relationship that he is the strongest cheerleader for the FSB within the Russian government, and he is a strong supporter of ever stronger legislation under which the FSB operates. And then the FSB returns that by being a very close supporter of his political line and of his regime. Alexander Bartnikov, right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, publicly stated, pretty much gave the Russian line. This is exactly what needs to be done. And since then has continued very much a hardline connection to that political line. And that is because the FSB is there to protect that political line.
And just to move on to the SVR, I find the head of the SVR really fascinating, Sergei Narishkin. He was a KGB officer. He went through training. That's how he met Putin. And one of the things that I wanted you just to touch on a little bit is the relationship between him and foreign intelligence, but he's also been involved in, I guess, looking at how the historical record can be quote unquote corrected, looking at the past and how the past should be marshaled in a particular way for the present. So I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. He's on this Historical Truth Commission, which we don't have time to go into, but which is really fascinating. He's the chair of the Russian Historical Association. I can just imagine the American Historical Association if, you know, a former American spy chief was appointed as the president. And then the other thing is 40% of Narishkin's PhD is apparently plagiarized, but apparently that, you know, he probably didn't write it and he's probably never read it. But anyway, we don't have time to go into all of that because I want to look at the why and the how. But talk to us about this relationship between. Can you hear me, Kevin?
Lost you a little bit there, Andrew, at the end of the question.
Is it me that's lost or Kevin?
I missed the end of your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yes.
You're back now. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So basically, the question is, we don't have time to unpack all of that, but tell us about this link between Narishkin, Russian intelligence, and the historical record.
I would first probably connect Narishkin to the end of the Soviet era. During the he was in the first chief directorate. He was actually expelled or had to leave his position because of a defector in the late Soviet era. He was an S&T collection officer, and that left, I believe, an impression on him that these defectors, traitors to the Russian system, basically got me in trouble. And during that time period, there was a lot of effort within the Soviet era to look at the truth of Soviet state security history. People like Alexander Yakovlev, who was an associate of Mikhail Gorbachev, published a lot of state security documents, declassified them. They're available now on the internet, that showed a much less rosy image of Soviet state security, that it was brutal, that it had a very dark history. If there's anything that the FSB and the SVR want to do today, it is to justify their existence in Russian society by saying, no, that dark image is wrong. And there are many great things that Soviet state security and intelligence services did that protected our country, that if you only look at the dark side, then you are getting an incorrect image. Not only an incorrect image, but it is an image that is supporting foreign disinformation efforts. So people like Narishkin and others are very active in promoting the other side of that story, the heroic side, the side that shows that Russian intelligence, state security services are the only reason why Russia still exists today. Without it, foreign countries would have destroyed it long ago, according to that historical narrative. And that is something that is, for many Russians, is welcome. You also have to think back to the 1990s when the Russian system was crumbling, when the Russian economic, political, and military systems were all weakened by a post-Soviet environment in which Russia tried to develop a democratic capitalist system but failed. That left a deep impression on people like Narishkin, Bortnikov, and Putin to never let that happen again. And one of the reasons for that historical emphasis is they can say, well, it only happened because state security was weakened. And if we allow state security to be strong like it should be, then that sort of chaos and weakness of the 1990s will not come back. So they are, the people like Narishkin and others are appealing to a very emotional button within the Russian population that Putin can say, I fixed this when I became the president. And many Russians are on board with that. So that historical connection is mixed in with the whole glorification of Putin as the irreplaceable savior of Russia.
There's so much things that I would love to touch on there. We can speak about maybe some other time. So we know who we're talking about, and they're doing it to secure the regime, to secure a particular ideology and elite. We've got the why, so we don't have time to get into all of them: political, economic, military, all the different types. But just in terms of the why, the directions it's going in, one question that I really want to ask is, how much is Russian intelligence involved in this geopolitical revisionism that we see this Ukraine, of course, this year, Georgia, the near abroad, the countries around the Soviet, former Soviet countries, you could say that. How much is Russian intelligence pushing, and how much is it just being pulled along, or is it a bit more of it's both pushing and being pulled?
I think it's probably a mix of both. And historically, Soviet and post-Soviet Russian leaders have not ever appreciated being told things that they don't already agree with. They don't like being told that maybe their policy direction is wrong, that it might be causing unrest. So intelligence services and state security services tend to tell Putin and his predecessors what they want to hear. But what that does, it creates somewhat of a vicious cycle. Because when they tell Putin what he wants to hear, he then feels very confident that he can proceed with his aggressive policies. And as he proceeds with aggressive policies, Russia then is criticized around the world for things like the annexation of Crimea, the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal in 2018, and now even more significantly, the military invasion of Ukraine. Russia gets criticized for those actions amongst many countries, particularly in Europe and in North America. And when Russia gets criticized, then the Russian state security leaders can then say, well, look at how evil the foreign countries are. And they can then reinforce that image back to Putin again, who then responds with even more aggressive policies, which then start the cycle over again. So it is part of a cycle that the intelligence and security services are part of that cycle of convincing the Russian leadership, Putin in particular, that they're on the right path, on the path that will make Russia stronger. When in reality, many of the things that Russia has done around the world have actually put Russia in a more difficult position, particularly politically, diplomatically, even militarily. Putin doesn't want to hear that. This was highlighted soon after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when some journalists claimed that the analysts who provided Putin with information that assured him that the military operation in Ukraine would be quick, would be over in no time, and Ukraine would be subdued, were wrong. And at least according to some journalists, although denied by the Russian government publicly, according to some journalists, the heads of some leaders in the FSB rolled because of that incorrect analysis, incorrect forecast. They were telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, but then when reality hit, they were then the ones who suffered for it. So it is a continual compounding cycle in which intelligence and security services cannot be extracted.
I thought it was quite interesting in February when Narishkin was given a dressing down by Putin and appeared visibly shaken. And it struck me that it's very different from someone like the director of Central Intelligence in the early 70s, Richard Helms, who, said to President Nixon, no, that can't happen, and he got fired for it. But we don't have time to go into that, unfortunately, because I want to leave time for questions. So a couple of questions on how the platforms, how this is all executed. So one thing that I wanted to know was, just for our listeners, is there one of these intelligence agencies that does all of the poisonings or the assassinations that we talk about here at the Spy Museum? So Skripal, Litvinenko, Navalny, Yushchenko, is that one specific part of Russian intelligence, or did they all have the capability to do that? Or help our readers understand this type of operation, because this is what hits the news and this is what they hear of most often.
Most of the assassinations that we have heard of in the past 15 years or so have been conducted either by the FSB or by Chechen-related individuals who are supported by the FSB. The GRU has been connected to some assassinations and some other sabotage operations, not just assassinations, but also physical sabotage in places like the Czech Republic or in other European countries. And the GRU is believed to have been associated with the Skripal assassination attempt because he was previously a GRU officer. But probably the most external assassinations that have occurred in the Putin era have been less publicized, and those are against Chechen militants who are around Europe and heavily, particularly in Turkey. And most of those assassinations, many of them successful, were probably tied to the FSB, because the FSB has the mission of counterterrorism, and that, to the FSB's mind, that is an internal security matter. Getting rid of Chechen terrorists, getting rid of Chechen militants around the world is just simply part and parcel of the FSB's counterterrorism mission. Other countries don't like it very much when a Chechen militant is shot in broad daylight in Berlin. That didn't go over very well with the German authorities. But for a Russian state security official, that is a legitimate target. So the FSB has been very much involved in those. And that is then also a tie back to the Soviet era.
And in terms of capabilities, so one of the things that you touch on the book is this, idea that the Russian intelligence leaders portray themselves, but we also pick up in the media or here in the West as the, Russian intelligence is 10 feet tall, it's omniscient, it's omnipotent, it can reach anybody anywhere. So I just wondered if you could give us like a very brief assessment of its capabilities now compared to, say, during the KGB, and maybe, just break that down for us in a couple of minutes, please, Kevin.
The only reason I could write this book is because there is so much publicly available information about Russian intelligence operations across the entire spectrum of capabilities, human, technical. There's just a lot of information out there. And that's probably not intentional. Many of those operations that Russian intelligence services have conducted have been caught. And they have been publicized by other governments around the world. When they get publicized, Russia calls that Russophobia. But to those other governments, they're just saying, hey, look, we found another Russian intelligence officer, or we uncovered another Russian computer-based collection activity. And if they're so good, they shouldn't be caught that many times. That's not to say that Russia has no capability at all. Russia has a long history of many successful intelligence and covert operations around the world. But they have been caught many times. And that is an indicator that maybe their tradecraft is not quite as strong as it may have been during the Soviet era.
And one thing that I wanted to just offer to you was, do you think that partly it's because, could it be that the tradecraft is not as good as it used to be, or they're not as operationally as efficient as they used to be? Or could it just be we're not inclined to do a double tap? If we really wanted the person to be just killed, we would definitely have made sure this is just, if it kills you, it kills you. If it doesn't, then you're a living, walking example of how we can reach you. If you're killed, you disappear. But if you're walking around with a pockmarked face, or if you're caught screaming on a plane, or if you're, these things that come out, because it's not. It doesn't seem to be a great way to get away with something. It's not like you're throwing a gun down a storm drain or something like that. This is like Novichok. This is like nuclear, biological, chemical material. So just really briefly, is it a possibility that maybe they just don't care? It's just burnishing our reputation for being, we're going to get you anyway?
That's a good question. And I would say that there are three different ways to look at Russian activities around the world, aggressive activities. One is incompetence, that some of them just get caught because they're not that good. An intelligence officer is caught with a computer that shows that same intelligence officer had traveled around the world and had been involved in other collection operations. That's bad tradecraft. Some is indifference. saying, well, we'll do whatever we darn well please. You can catch us if we want, but you're not going to stop us. Another is ignorance. I think some of these activities the Russians may actually believe are going to be successful, and they don't even think about the possibility that maybe trying to assassinate someone on another country's sovereign territory is going to make them upset. Just understanding how a democratic country will respond to that sort of thing, or respond to meddling in elections, how important that sort of event is to a democratic country. If you get caught meddling in, the Russians may not fully understand why the big deal, because elections in Russia are not necessarily legitimate or real. So I would say that, and I've thought through this a little bit, I'd probably write a paper someday, that the answer why is a mix of that incompetence, indifference, and ignorance. And different cases probably could be interpreted different ways.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting, the point you touch on there, even thinking about the differences between reactions to the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, and then Afghanistan in 79. But yeah, that's for another time. So final question from me. I think it's quite interesting. A lot of the other stuff that we hear about Russian intelligence is related to cyber. It's related to Fuzzy Bear, Cozy Bear, some of these groups that are linked to or affiliated with Russian intelligence. What's going on there? Is that also a specific part of Russian intelligence? Is that also, for example, you said that the FSB for a lot of the assassinations, is it a specific part? And the second part of the question is that 10 feet tall? Because that's the way that we often read about it here as well, that they're cyber superpower.
Yeah. Russia does not use the acronyms or the prefix cyber except when it is discussing foreign countries targeting Russia. So Russia doesn't separate the concept of computer-based operations from everything else. Computer-based operations are just one of the methods that can be used for collection and for covert operations, for sabotage purposes. There is not a cyber section in my book, because in the political collection chapter, there is a whole section about political collection being done via computers. In the military intelligence section, there is a section on computer-based actions directed toward military intelligence collection. And in the covert action chapter, there is. But there's no separate cyber organization within Russia, and thus there's not a separate section in the book. Cyber for Russia is mixed with all its other capabilities, and it pulls from the different capabilities that it has available to it to accomplish whatever the mission is at hand. And all of those different organizations that I mentioned have a connection to the computer-based realm. The SVR was caught in the SolarWinds hacking activity a few years ago. FSB has been caught multiple times. And GRU has also been involved in a number of particularly sabotage operations using computers. So sabotage or covert operations. So computers are simply for Russia a mechanism to have whatever effect they're trying to accomplish.
Okay, there's so much I would love to keep talking to you about, but I think we'll turn it over to Amanda for questions. Thank you so much, Kevin.
So interesting. And Hannah, Shauna, and I were teamsing behind the scenes, really appreciating your very straightforward, intelligible answers, very clear. So thank you so much for that, Kevin, and great questions. Andrew, we have great questions from the audience. This one came in really early on from a friend in London who watches a lot, and he asks, wondering about relationships to private sector links. such as, Warsaw Pact or Cold War ally companies in oil, gas, mining. How is that continuing on, or any care to comment on that?
Okay, so the Russian, there are many Russian government either owned or connected companies, and they are often the largest companies in Russia. And in a number of occasions, the leaders of those companies, or if not the leaders, the security managers of those companies are former state security officers. What that gives the state security and intelligence organizations in Russia is a direct in to those companies. Major companies like Gazprom, the largest gas company, Rosneft, which is the largest oil company, are led by people with state security backgrounds and who have personal connections to state security leaders and to Putin himself. What that means is that when Russia needs to use that company either for cover or for legitimation of its operations around the world, that company is very willing to do that. There's also connections between particularly FSB and private sector hackers. Although one of the FSB's missions is to protect the Russian information environment from hackers, it also directly supports hacking groups that then help it accomplish its missions around Russia and around the former Soviet states as well. So it has a close connection with many private sector organizations, and those private sector organizations that refuse to have a close connection with the FSB are often penalized for it. The FSB, there's a law that gives the FSB access to communications that travel across Russia's networks, and companies that have resisted that FSB access to their communications have been sanctioned for it. So the business environment by force is a close ally to the FSB and also the SVR, and then there are businesses connected to GRU as well.
Gosh, we have a lot of great questions, but can you speak about how the three services manage or run illegals, if they all do, and do they have differences in how they do that?
The primary organizations that run illegals are the SVR and the GRU because they are the primary foreign intelligence organizations. The FSB is connected with the illegals program, but that's more in the support and the identification of individuals who might be good candidates. The illegals program celebrated its 100th anniversary a few years ago as well. So it's a long practice program within the Soviet and post-Russian intelligence structure. And it basically is the identification of individuals who can operate outside of Russia covertly, usually without even identifying any connection to Russia at all, although in more recent times that has been modified somewhat. Historically, illegals are those who hide all connections to the Soviet Union or Russia, communications connections, financial connections, even familial and ethnic connections, and they operate separately from any official Russian government organization. So they can operate even if the embassy is under counterintelligence pressure, or in the worst case, the embassy is closed during war, illegals can continue to operate. Illegals there have been thousands of illegals over the years. Some of them have been publicized. On the 100th anniversary of the illegals, the SVR declassified the names of a number of illegals who had received the Hero of the Soviet Union or the Hero of the Russian Federation Award medal, and then used that in that historical narrative that Andrew was asking about to show the greatness and the success of Russian intelligence over the years. So illegals are something of which the Russian intelligence services are very proud, and they are an important arm for spotting, assessing, and in some cases running very sensitive assets.
How are new members recruited?
There's a couple different ways. There's actually a website for the FSB, and that says if you want to be an FSB officer, here's what you have to do. There is an FSB Academy. It's basically a mix between a tradecraft training organization and an undergraduate degree producing school. So young Russians can apply to the FSB Academy. There's not surprisingly, a strict security background investigation that's done. And not unlike the security background investigation done for US intelligence services. In other cases, you don't apply to be a clandestine officer. You get noticed and someone comes to you and says, I have an offer for you. And with illegals, that tends to be—
Kevin, could you turn that offer down?
I'm sorry?
Could you turn that offer down?
Oh, can you turn it down? Well, during the Soviet era, you probably couldn't. In today's environment, it's probably a little freer than it was during the Soviet era, although it's still an offer that can be hard to refuse.
I cut you off. You had an add-on to that statement when I asked you.
I was just saying that the illegals are often those who do not apply at all, but they are approached because they have some skill. Maybe they have a certain language ability, or they understand a certain part of the world, or they have a certain scientific expertise that's needed for Russian intelligence. They might be approached by an SVR recruiter or by a GRU recruiter and say, we need you. In the GRU, officers often come from within the military structure. They are loyal, capable officers who have proven themselves, and they are then approached and said, we'd like to transfer you into GRU. That's probably more common for the military intelligence. With FSB, there are actually those who can apply.
Gosh, we have such diverse questions and time is ticking. How would you characterize the intelligence services capacity to innovate technologically? How do you see them evolving and transforming over the next few decades?
They're actually quite good at that. The FSB, for example, has a science and technology service, the purpose for which is to supply the FSB with new investigative detection and intelligence technologies. And they contract out to scientific research centers around Russia. The FSB itself and the SVR, both, and actually the GRU as well, have scientific research centers directly affiliated with them that are always looking for new technologies that will assist with their clandestine missions. There's been some discussion that illegals may not be capable, a possibility any longer, because technology makes the ability to operate covertly abroad much more difficult. But the Russian services have science and technology research capabilities that have not accepted that as a defeat, and they continue to look for ways to place their people abroad in clandestine assignments, even if technology makes that more difficult. But we saw an arrest of an illegal just a couple months ago who was trying to travel to Netherlands. He was operating under a Brazilian identity, and he had been placed in that Brazilian identity several years after illegals were arrested in the United States. And so the illegal service within the SVR certainly did not use those arrests in the United States as evidence that illegals are no longer valid. So the Science and Technology Service is a big part of finding the ways to make those operations still work.
Well, the time has flown by. Andrew, do you have any closing remarks?
Just really briefly, so you mentioned earlier the way that Kevin answered the questions, and they were direct, logical, thorough, and well structured, and that's the way the book's written. So I would just encourage people to download the book and give it a read.
Thank you.
It's such a rare thing for us to just say download the book. And I think we're going to have some copies that we can give away at real hard copies at some future public events, but that doesn't help you if you are not here in DC. So that's why you can download it. And we have Kevin with us and Andrew with us virtually. So thank you both for being terrific. Thank you to the public for joining us. So many really good questions. I'm sorry that we did not get to them, but I think I will share them with Kevin and Andrew after this.
Please do, and I'm happy to answer questions afterward. This is what I like to do. So if there are questions that people have, I'd be happy to address them.
Thank you. That is very generous. We will do that. And if you've enjoyed this and you like spending time with me and Andrew, we will be back on Thursday, September 1st at noon Eastern Time. Andrew has Bob Baer as his guest to talk about the fourth man. So that should be very interesting. Please check our website for that program, other programs to sign up for. And if you've enjoyed this and you feel like you'd like to support the Spy Museum, we would really appreciate that. And you can also on our website contribute to the museum. So thanks everyone. Stay well. Enjoy the rest of August, and we'll see you in September.